Okay, well, I guess we can get started. Welcome everyone to the last Team Science Skills series of this year. So we will have new workshops on these Team Science Skills series coming up in fall 2022. We also may have more sort of one-on-one mentoring coming up with this program. So keep an eye out for that. But first, I want to introduce our speaker today. That should say team leadership and motivation, not formation and development. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Sean Burke from the University of Central Florida. She's a key figure in team science. She studies a bunch of different phenomenon, especially in very high stakes and functionally diverse teams, which should be relevant to the talk here today. She works with real teams all the time. She has several federally funded grants that she's working on with teams that are, actually doing teamwork in the ground, not your let's get a couple students together and see what happens sort of studies. She works in a bunch of different spaces: business, military, healthcare, space, and of course, science teams. She's a great friend and a great presenter, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sean Burke.
Thank you, Chris. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Do you guys see the full screen?
Yep, you're good.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so thank you guys for coming today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about team leadership and the role that team leaders play within teams and how they're really foundational to effective team performance, and how they go about kind of creating conditions that allow or facilitate team performance. And in doing so, you'll see aspects of motivation kind of peppered throughout here, and I'll try to highlight those as we go through. Let's see, Chris already did this, so he did an excellent introduction, so I really don't need to say anything here on this slide. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this one. All right, I wanted to start off by just kind of getting you guys, putting you in the mindset. So I want to do just a really quick kind of thought exercise. We're not going to take long on this, but I'd like you to think of two things. So if you look on the pictures on the screen, you'll see the teams that are on the left-hand side here, they look like they're happy. And so I want you to think about a team that you've been part of that produced good quality work. And at the end of the day, you felt like, hey, this might be a team I'd like to work with again. I'd like you to think about that and maybe just write down 2 or 3 characteristics, 2 or 3 things that you thought made that team really effective. And then on the flip side, I'd like you to think about the opposite. Unfortunately, we've probably all also been on these kind of teams, the ones where all you want to do is run out of the room. So I'd like you to think about a team, let's say this maybe less effective and that you really would not like to work with again if you had your choice, and think about the characteristics that maybe made you feel like that. So if you can take, I'll just give you maybe 2 minutes and just jot 2 or 3 characteristics down for me. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you guys probably to put those in chat, but just I'll give you a minute or 2. Okay, hopefully you guys have been able to think of of something that a couple on the positive side and a couple on for that team that could have maybe worked better together. For those of you that are by a computer, and can you in the chat just write down 1 or 2 characteristics of those teams that you felt worked well together? So I've got, it was a safe environment, it was collaborative, there was communication, trust. Communication seems to be a key thing here. Motivated, clear direction. Chris, you're not allowed to play. Okay, can you also, let me see, let me scroll down, make sure I'm not. Now, can you think about the flip side and write in some of the characteristics of those teams that didn't perform as well? So only one voice heard, passive aggressive, complaining to one another, complaining about other parts of the team, not collaborative, poor vision. Okay, so you guys have hit on, based on your experiences, some really good differences between those teams that are fun and productive and those teams that, like I said, you just kind of want to run out of the room with. What I'm going to argue here, and I want you to think about this, because I'm going to argue that leadership is foundational to making some of those positive experiences positive, and good leaders will step in and limit those not so fun experiences if you want. So as I'm going through and talking about what leaders can do to facilitate the conditions that allow teams to perform effectively, kind of keep those teams in the back of your mind, because they may help to ground some of this stuff. And thank you guys for participating. So there has been, a long line of research that's been conducted on leadership in general. Leadership's been around forever. And when we start talking about team leadership, it's a little bit different. So if I'm just leading an individual, then, probably the primary thing I'm concerned about is making sure that that individual has task-related skills, right? They know how to do their job. When we start talking about teams, what you see, although there's several definitions out there, what you tend to see is what really gets emphasized is that team leadership revolves around a dynamic process of social problem solving. So within teams, we're not only concerned about those task-related skills, but we're also concerned about those kind of teamwork skills, the social-emotional skills, those things that allow members to coordinate and communicate with one another. And some of you guys have hit on that as being, the positive side and the negative side. So when you think about team leadership, a lot of what we see, the primary view is that the leader's main job is to do or get done whatever isn't being adequately handled for group needs. And that's pretty broad. So I'm going to talk in a minute about what some of those things are. But as we go through this, you're going to see that 2 things. Part of those things are task related. Part of those things are more teamwork related, or deal with how can members engage in interdependent interaction when I have to actually rely on somebody else. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that you'll notice that it says it's a leader's main job to do or to get done, which means sometimes it can be through delegation or somebody else stepping up. And so the other thing that we see when we talk about team leadership, and I'll highlight this in a little bit, is that it's not only about your hierarchical leader, which is what we're most traditionally used to hearing about, but within teams, we also hear about leadership getting distributed throughout the team. And that's a way that we can build capacity within the team. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. So if we begin to think about, okay, well, if the leader's trying to meet group needs, what are these conditions? What is it that teams need to be effective? So Richard Hackman and his colleagues at Harvard have done a lot of this foundational work that talk about what can team leaders do to facilitate the conditions for teams to be effective. Now, it doesn't guarantee, but when these conditions aren't in place, it makes it much more difficult. So I'm going to kind of go through these at a high level, and then we'll spend time kind of digging down into the weeds. So the first thing is I need to make sure that my team's actually a team. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. I need to make sure as a leader, does my team have compelling direction? That's directly under my control as a team leader. Does it have an enabling structure? Most of that's under my control. Is the organization supportive? Is there a supportive context? Sometimes that's under the control of the leaders. Sometimes that's a little bit harder to control. And then the last thing is expert coaching available? Now, this speaks to, it doesn't say that the leader has to do that coaching. Oftentimes they do, but that coaching just needs to be available there. And that serves to help team members to stay up to date on their task work skills, but also their teamwork skills. So let's kind of dive into each of these. So the first condition, is it a real team? So what we find a lot of times is that organizations tend to think, well, I can just take, and if I have more heads in for the problem, more people, I'll just put more people in there and, that'll give me good performance. However, not all tasks need teams. So the first condition is it really a team task? And what I mean by that is there a degree of interdependence? Do we need to rely on one another, coordinate our actions in order to achieve whatever our outcome is that we're trying to achieve? If not, then there are other mechanisms. You don't need to invest in the overhead of what teams bring. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen is just some of the literature has talked about different levels of interdependence. So how coordinated are my teams? So at the very kind of at the low end on the, let's say, I guess that's the lower left-hand side, we have sequential interdependence. And that's more like, think about an assembly line. So my output serves as your input, your output serves as somebody else's. So the workflow, there is coordination there, but the workflow, only goes in one direction. Moving up a little bit is this notion of reciprocal. So workflow in this case goes back and forth. It's bidirectional, but it's primarily dyadic. And then at the most intensive, we have kind of everybody working with everybody else and relying on everybody else. And in its truest form, that intensive at the bottom would also mean that the team was self-managing. Now, the only reason I point this out is just to realize that, interdependence can look different, but at the end of the day, it's about, do I need to rely on somebody else in order to get that work done? So interdependence, key thing, not there, not a real team. The other things that we pay attention to is, does the team have clear boundaries? Now we recognize that anymore, teams are much more fluid than they used to be. However, there still needs to be some level of clear boundaries. So team members need to understand who's in and who's out. And there also needs to be at least some level of authority to manage our own work processes. Now, that doesn't mean that we're self-managing, but it does mean that we have some degree of autonomy to decide how we want to carry out the work. The second condition that's needed for teams to be effective is compelling direction. So if we think about leadership, one of the immediate things that comes to mind, even if you know nothing about leadership, is that leadership is about influence, leadership is about providing direction. However, all direction isn't the same. So compelling direction serves to orient and motivate the team. What I mean by that, sorry, one second. What I mean by that is, number one, it's clear, right? So it's not full of a lot of jargon. It allows members to understand what they're supposed to be doing, what their ultimate goal is, and may give, and that allows them to kind of, once they get started, it allows them to reflect on their progress and judge, where they might need to adjust things. It also needs to be challenging and consequential. So nobody likes to engage in any tasks where they feel like it's just busy work, right? So that's the consequential part. It's motivating to the team to feel like they're having an impact. This is something that's important. And we also know from the goal setting literature that having an aspect of challenge within that direction is also energizing. Let me skip this one because I'll just say that, what that compelling direction does, but I've already kind of said that, is that it allows them to better structure their work and decide how work is going to be distributed. And then because the leader is giving that direction to the team as a whole, it helps to begin to build mental models for the team in terms of, what the task is and what members might be likely to be doing and what kind of environment they're in. The third condition that leaders can facilitate is an enabling structure. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here. And as we move forward towards the end, I'll come back to this again. There are kind of three aspects here. The first one are leaders are essential for ensuring that core norms of conduct are established. And this is very simple, kind of what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior within the team. And the exact norms that teams come up with are going to differ, based on different circumstances in the composition of that team. However, when we look into the literature, what we see is there are at least, two things that we need to make sure that we include in there in order to enable team performance. Number one, we want norms that encourage team members to capitalize on the diversity of resources present. So, whether you're in an organizational team or whether you're on a research team, organizational teams, as the complexity of problems increase, we see, more and more cross-functional teams, cross-disciplinary teams. And if we're talking about research, everything's emphasizing this, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, where you really, you have the idea there, I guess, is you have these resources where having the diversity of your membership can bring different perspectives on the team, to the team. But members need to be encouraged to capitalize on that diversity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about one of the things that leaders should promote is psychological safety, and that helps to do that. The second thing are leaders need to promote norms that revolve around the real-time adjustment of strategy, environmental scanning, and team self-correction. And this just speaks to the notion of teams kind of continually learning and being ready to adjust their strategies in response to environmental events, whether those are inside the team sometimes or sometimes they're outside the teams, and kind of reflecting on what's working well and maybe what's not working as well, and not getting tunnel vision. Want to jump forward a second. So I wanted to highlight, before I go through the other two, I wanted to highlight one of the things that leaders can do to help clarify the direction and to help clarify and establish norms that everybody kind of buys into. So there's an intervention called team charters. And this is it's a structured activity that's normally done at the beginning when the team first comes together. And it just serves to clarify the team expectations, what the obligations to the team are, and what the team outcomes are. What are the expected outcomes? You see an example of some of the things that might be discussed over here on the right-hand side. So what are our objectives? How are we going to operate? Who's going to do what? What norms do we have? If we're operating on, I'm going to say operating on Zoom, how do we handle, when someone wants to speak up? And some of those are very simple, but they guide team actions. And then how are we going to measure our performance? What are our expectations? When this is done early on, it again serves to create these shared mental models that therefore provide the foundation for teams to work collaboratively together. Now, going back to the other two. Moving this around. Okay, so the second part of enabling structure is the work designed well? And sometimes the leaders can have more or less impact on that. But basically, we want tasks where the members can identify with the task. They see it as a meaningful experience. There's a sense of autonomy, and they're able to gain some degree of feedback from the work itself. All this speaks to basically at the end of the day that the work is motivating. Nobody likes to do things that they think are inconsequential. Most people don't like to do things where they feel like they're being micromanaged or get absolutely no feedback in terms of how they're progressing on that task. The last portion here within enabling structure deals with team composition. So we can talk about the size of the team. And I don't know if there's really a magic number here in terms of the size, but what you do want to think about as a leader is, I need enough that I can get the work done, but I don't want to put people on the team just to put people on the team, because the more people I put on there, there is a degree of cognitive overhead that comes with being on a team and those coordination requirements. The other part of that is, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the team members. Sometimes leaders have the may be able to impact that in the sense that they actually get to select the members for their teams. Other times they may be given the set of members, and then it becomes more about kind of development on the back end. Continuing with this team composition, and I'm sure Chris has probably already had somebody talk to you on team composition, so I'm just going to highlight a few things here. So a lot of times what we see is, I alluded to this earlier, but what we see is that organizations think that if I just take a whole bunch of experts and I put them on a team, I'm going to have awesome performance. Everything's going to go well. We know that's not true. The literature talks about task work, which is my experts, but it also talks about teamwork skills. Task work gets us part of the way there. Teamwork gets us the rest of the way. We can see that in organizations. This is actually a study that was done with sports teams where they wanted to begin to look at, what happens if I put a whole bunch of elite players, task expertise, on a team? Do I get this kind of linear effect where the more task expertise I have in terms of number of players, do I continue to get increases in performance? And what they found, they looked at, I think it was like 10 years worth of data with regards to baseball teams, soccer teams, and basketball teams. And they specifically picked these types of teams. Baseball teams are much less interdependent, require much less coordination than do your other team types. And that level of interdependence was found to make a difference. So for the baseball teams, what they found was as talent increased, so the more elite players they had, the better performance was. For the teams that had to coordinate their actions and had a higher level of interdependence, they found that worked up until a point. And when they got to around 60% of the team members being elite, they started to see a drop off in performance. Members weren't coordinating their actions as well. And so this is just one example of that idea of that we need to pay attention to more than just task work. And that's a lot of times what organizations look at is that task work part. Kind of on those same lines, Morganson and his colleagues have done work on, when we think about teams, again, it's moving beyond that task work, and it's part of the leader's responsibility to be thinking about this, where team members come in and they're lacking in some of the knowledge or skills, then the leader needs to work to help get them that right coaching to bring those up. So one thing that the literature has shown is obviously we need KSAs, we need teamwork knowledge. So we need to know how to function in team settings. There's also been quite a bit of work done in the area of personality. So extroversion, agreeableness, emotional stability, conscientiousness have all been shown to be effective and desirable characteristics to facilitate team performance. But we also need to think about social skills because we are interacting with other people here. So social perceptiveness, being able to read those social cues that my other team members are providing are important. That allows team members to know how they need to adapt their actions. Coordination, again, because we're interacting with others, negotiation, persuasion kind of skills, those are all important. But it gets much more complicated than this. I'm not going to get into that complication because even now, what I'm talking about are those kind of things that we need to pay attention to make sure that people can work well as a team. But we're still really talking about this at an individual level. We haven't begun to say, well, how much agreeableness do I need? How much extroversion? Does everybody need to be agreeable? And there's a lot of work going on right now to try and figure out exactly when do we need homogeneity? When do we need heterogeneity? And how do these different I'll say buckets, if you will. How do they combine? So some of what we do know, it's not always clear cut. So we know that in terms of conscientiousness, we know the homogeneity is good. We generally want everybody to have high levels of conscientiousness, and that relates to team performance. When we start talking about extroversion and agreeableness, we want more homogeneity. And that seems to promote cohesion or the bonding of members together. Going more in the science realm, the research realm, science teams, the literature has shown that publications that have gender heterogeneous teams, so surface level features, receive 34% more citations than same gender teams. Having at least one female PI, I always like that one, increases the likelihood of funding and innovative ideas. And I just want to highlight the one down here at the bottom. Smaller teams have been found they're more likely to develop innovative research. Again, sometimes when you get into those larger teams, it becomes more difficult to manage some of these dynamics. When we start thinking about characteristics in composition, one other thing that leaders need to kind of keep in their back of their mind is that if you're not careful, we have some features that are surface level. So I look and I can see that you're of a different gender or you're a different race. Those are surface level characteristics. There are other things that are deep level characteristics that are really about values. So personality, cultural values. The literature has shown that when teams first start working together, it's these surface level features that can sometimes come into play, and they can create kind of hypothetical dividing lines in the team. Think about, like, they're called fault lines, but if you think about the earth, and those dividing lines end up splitting a group into subgroups, and they align on one or more attributes. The more attributes they align on, the stronger the fault line. Later, what you find is that surface level features tend to not have as much of an impact, and it's more about those deep level values. Now, fault lines in and of themselves aren't bad because they exist in many teams, but from a leadership standpoint, we need to think about that, and we need to think about when they come into play is when they become salient. And sometimes that's through signs and symbols just in the room, or what's, what the leaders or what gets highlighted within the team. When those subgroups form, though, the danger is that it limits information sharing, and then you begin to sometimes get into a us versus we, and sometimes you get more kind of relationship conflict. The last thing that I like to bring out, that when we think about composition and enabling structure, that needs to kind of be in the back of your mind as a leader, and this probably isn't on the front end, this is probably once your team's actually performing, is the notion of team roles. So the literature talks about that within teams, we know that these are informal roles. So there's not something that's actually assigned to people. But we know that there are certain sets of roles that facilitate task accomplishment and are instrumental in teams. And we also know that on the social side of the house, there are roles that facilitate the social emotional health of the team, and that teams need both of these functions to be fulfilled, to be at their best performance. So, on the task side, you can think about the person that's coordinating, sequencing actions within the team. You can even think about that from an external standpoint, the boundary spanner, right? That's reaching back out to the organization, bringing in information, pushing out information, or maybe they're reaching out to another set of team, an external stakeholder the team works with. You can think about the evaluator. So one of the things that we know is that teams can have the tendency over time to get into these like groupthink, routinized, monotonous kind of, I found something that works, and so I found my hammer, I'm just gonna go forward with it. So having somebody on the team that kind of plays that devil's advocate is an important thing. On the social side, you can think of the team builder. So the person that serves to manage conflict, that serves to motivate team members to make sure that voices are being heard. You can think about the jokester, the entertainer, and there's a limit to that. But the person that serves to relieve stress sometimes during high workload, the roles there on the bottom, the attention seeker and the negatives, we actually want to stay away from those. Those are bad things. But there's some emerging work that's being done looking at how personality might predispose individuals to take on some of these roles. But things to keep in the background and that the leaders need to be thinking about to make sure that these things are being represented. Now, I've covered quite a bit within the enabling structure. So let me just kind of summarize. So when we're thinking about how to create the best structure and composition, it's not always about selecting the best individual team members. We really need to think about the interpersonal dynamics and how those members come together. Diversity is critical. In some cases, we do want teams homogeneous on some characteristics. In other cases, having homogeneity can limit critical thinking, creative thinking, and can kind of get us into just adherence to the status quo and just kind of go in with blinders on. And then the last thing is, to the extent that we can, keep your teams small. What I mean by that is, don't put more people on them than what we need. I think this is the fourth condition. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here on this one, but the other condition that leaders can help to facilitate is ensuring that there's a supportive organizational context. So is the organization actually have reward systems that are rewarding team performance? Or are they really just focused on rewarding individual behavior? Are there information systems that support the team and help the team to understand where they are, what resources they have, how they're performing? And then lastly, training opportunities. We'll talk more about training opportunities in a minute. The last condition that leaders are keeping an eye on is expert coaching. So again, this doesn't mean that the leader is doing the coaching. They can, but it can also be someone external to the team. And when we look at the literature, what we see is there's kind of three big buckets that teams tend to need coaching on. The first one deals with effort. So sometimes very early in a team's development, where they really haven't built that commitment and that cohesion, what you see is social loafing going on, or members not fully contributing. They're kind of hanging back. And this can especially, I think, be a problem now that a lot of us are virtual, and the more that we work on Zoom, if someone's turned their camera off, are they really paying attention? What's going on? So there's coaching there that's working to kind of build this high shared commitment. The second thing that coaching does is we can, as a team begins to perform and they've been together for a while, coaching can address their performance strategies. And what they're trying to do here is the coach is trying to make sure that the team doesn't get into kind of this mindless reliance on just habitual routines. So, they're paying attention and they're questioning their work processes to see, do we need to adjust something? And then the third type normally comes more towards the end of the team or the end of a performance cycle, and talks about knowledge and skills. So here it's really more educational. Do we need to work on the sharing of knowledge or the development of member skills? Do we understand, who has what type of expertise and contributions? When we're talking about the knowledge and skill portion, I just wanted to bring this figure up. This is, they're called the 7 C's. But what I wanted to highlight here is a lot of times when we're doing that expert coaching that's revolving around more of the educational towards the end, what we're focusing on is either trying to fix something with communication, we're trying to realign team cognition, realign activities that fall into coordination, so backup behavior, mutual monitoring, or we're focusing more on the attitudinal dimensions, the motivational factors, which is this cooperation box. So that's things like trust, psychological safety that I'll talk about in a minute, cohesion. But those are some of the areas that targets that tend to be focused on there. I probably need to speak faster. So I've kind of highlighted, if you will, what leaders can do, what they need to keep an eye on, what are the conditions that leaders need to keep an eye on, but how do they actually facilitate these things? So if we step back a second, think about teams, we know that teams perform certain activities when they're actually working on the task. And those activities, that's what's called action phase. So I'm directly working on the task. I'm resuscitating somebody, or I'm taking somebody's blood pressure, or I'm actually, writing my proposal if I'm a research scientist. And then we have classes and activities that teams do during the transition phase. And these are periods where the team tends to be reflecting on their interaction and kind of during downtime, if you will. So we can also, if teams do this while they're working, then we can, and leadership is supposed to help meet team needs. And we can also think about, well, what do leaders do for teams during these two different phases? And I'll say these phases, they're not actually distinct phases in practice. They kind of intertwine. So from a leadership standpoint, during transition phase activities, you see leaders composing the team. You've already seen me talk about that in the enabling structure. They provide direction, they define the mission, they establish expectations and goals. All that we talked about earlier within the direction and the norms. They structure and plan activities, and they train and they develop the team. Right? You're not going to train somebody as they're actually doing the task. You kind of wait to some of that downtime, when they're not busy, and then you might step in and give them some feedback and some developmental activities maybe. While team members are performing the task, leaders are monitoring the team. They're managing team boundaries. So there's certain cases where the leader does not want outside entities to disrupt what the team is doing. There's other times where they need to be letting information into the team. They challenge the team, right? They can come in and kind of play that devil's advocate role to try and make sure that they don't get into that mindless routine. When needed, they are a team member. When needed, they step in and they can help out with the team tasks. They can perform backup behavior for team members. They provide resources. They also encourage team self-management, and key, they support the social climate. So, a lot of the stuff on the top part of this action phase, a lot of these leadership functions and behaviors are more around task-related activities. And then you've got this social side at the bottom. Leaders do all these things, and that's kind of how they get to those enabling conditions that I talked about. I want to highlight 3 of these things, though, because I think, well, 2 reasons. Number one, I think they're especially important when we're talking about teams that are working in complex environments where, which is almost everybody anymore, where the situation is changing and the environment's changing, and my team needs to be able to adapt, and we need to be able to be resilient and respond to stressors. And also, I'm picking these 3 because they all speak to a motivational aspect and are motivating for team members. So 3 I'm going to talk about next are encouraging team self-management, supporting the social climate, and then training and developing the team. And so I want to give you some insight into exactly what leaders can do with this in this regard. So in terms of promoting self-management, we're going to talk about shared leadership, social support, and is going to be psychological safety, and then we'll talk about team learning. So there's a long history. Normally when we think about team leadership, we think about kind of top down. There's a single leader and they provide direction to the team, and they kind of know all. But more recently, there's been this a movement towards not negating that formal leader, but this idea that leadership can also be distributed throughout the team. So leadership are behaviors. It's a position, but they're also behaviors. And then when you start talking about working in complex environments, it's really a tall order to assume that a single individual is going to be able to carry out all the leadership functions that a team needs. So this notion of shared leadership takes advantage of the resources and the expertise that relies within the team. And it can be carried out in several different ways. You could have 2 people actually engaging in leadership functions at the same time. That's more of a co-leadership. You can also have it where people are rotating. So one member stepping up and doing something, and then they step down and somebody else steps up and does some leadership functions. And sometimes those are driven by expertise. They also might be driven by the degree of workload that somebody has. Why is this good? Why do we care about this? Well, first of all, and the reason it's here is because shared leadership has been found to promote, to explain more team performance over and above just vertical leadership. So traditional leadership. And again, it does not negate that. In good teams, those hierarchical traditional leaders set the conditions for shared leadership to happen. It's also motivational. So we find that shared leadership relates to team members doing more organizational citizenship behaviors, or more behaviors that go beyond what my actual role and responsibilities are, which relates to effort. We find that team members tend to be more satisfied. And we also find that shared leadership relates to creativity and innovation. But there are some conditions depending on the form of shared leadership that we're talking about. And I'm not going to go through this whole model here, but just to highlight a few things. So if we're talking about the rotated, where members kind of step up and step down, and it's more kind of sequential, people have to want to lead, right? Not everybody wants to be in a leadership position. There also needs to be a fair degree of trust, because leadership, I can't lead if people decide that they don't want to follow me. So the members in my team need to trust that I have the competence to lead, and that I'm going to lead in a benevolent manner. Team cognition comes into play there, because transactive memory systems, when those exist within team members, they allow team members to know who has what expertise, therefore who might be in a best position to take on particular leadership functions, as an example. So like I said, we know that it's related to performance. We know that it's especially important as task interdependence increases, as the complexity of the task increases, when team tenure is short, so the team hasn't been together for a long time, and it's been shown to actually have more of a relationship with performance within virtual teams as compared to face-to-face teams. When we may want to stay away from it, it can be more time consuming. So if we're dealing with a situation, with a short time frame, we don't want to go and engage in shared leadership during emergency situations, for example. What tends to happen is, and that reverts back to the hierarchical leader, and that's part of those norms that are set up early for how the team's going to work. And then it can have a negative effect if we've got fault lines based on social categories like age and gender. Again, it can be more difficult to engage in shared leadership, because there's that divide that's inhibiting that information sharing and people wanting to lead. Okay. The second thing that I wanted to highlight that I think leaders can do is they can set the climate within the team and promote a climate of psychological safety. So psychological safety is a team climate variable that talks about the feeling that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And this is important, because if we're thinking about teams wanting to learn and adapt and move forward, right, the members have to feel comfortable voicing up their opinions. And what we see in really high performing teams is that leaders listen to people no matter where they are in the hierarchy. Because sometimes it's the people that are on the ground that have the most information. So this notion's been around for a while, associated with the work of Amy Edmondson. But back in 2015, Google did a study, and it really kind of pushed it out into the popular press. So they went and they interviewed about 200 of their workers, and then looked at, I think, 250 characteristics across 150 teams at Google, to see what was predicting their high and their lower performing teams at Google. What they actually found, that for them, it wasn't so much who was on the team, as much as, again, your expertise, as much as how those members interacted, structured their work, and viewed their contributions. And top of that list for them was psychological safety. So the degree to which the members felt like they were psychologically safe was a key characteristic for them in terms of higher performing teams. And you can see some of the other, the top 5 here, all of which we've kind of talked about in one way or another today. Why is it important? And then I'll tell you what leaders can do to promote this. It's important, it's motivational. So we know that when there's more psychological safety on a team, it promotes work engagement and commitment. It promotes that organizational citizenship behavior that I talked about a few minutes ago. It promotes learning, and part of that learning is because it fosters the information exchange amongst team members. Members feel free to speak up, even if it's something that might be unpopular. They don't feel like that there's going to be retribution in any way for speaking up. That in turn facilitates knowledge creation, often leads to the reduction of errors and innovation and creativity. So what can leaders do to promote this? Number one, they've got to make it an explicit priority. So they actually, I'll say, have to walk the walk, and not only say that psychological safety is important, but they have to model the behavior. They have to, in some cases, if they make a mistake, they have to speak up about that. But it's not enough to say that I want everybody on the team to speak up. The leaders need to actively engage in ensuring that people do. So be respectful. Thank people when they offer their point of view. Be careful about your facial expressions. They say a lot, right? Focus on what is right, not who is right. And keep an eye out for how often members speak up. If you've got someone that's not speaking up, try to pull something out of them. It may make them uncomfortable at first, but it speaks to the value you're placing on them, and they might have some really unique information. Early on, within those norms at the beginning, establish norms for how failure is going to be handled. So establishing a norm that, failure is a learning process. Embrace productive conflict. So not all conflict is bad. Task conflict can actually be very functional. And somebody had said in the comments, I'm pointing over to my other screen, someone had said over in the comments that, team members that weren't nice to one another, right? So part of psychological safety is a leader setting up that norm early on. That type of behavior just is not going to be tolerated. A few other things, so they can leaders engage in supportive behavior. Some of the facilitation stuff I just talked about ties back to that, but the provision of coaching opportunities, again, it's showing signs that you value the members and value their opinions. Gaining trust, right? So part of psychological safety is feeling like no one's going to slam me if I speak up, and the leader is a key person in that. So if team members believe that the leader is trustworthy, they have integrity, they're looking out for the good of the team, that's going to be more likely to promote psychological safety. And then there are certain leadership styles that just by their virtual nature tend to facilitate psychological safety. So transformational leadership, which is a lot about empowerment, ethical leadership, and shared leadership have all been shown to as things that leaders can do to foster psychological safety within their teams. Oh, okay. A few more, I know I'm over my 45. So the other thing I wanted to highlight was team learning. So psychological safety contributes to team learning. Team learning is essential. It's been defined in several different ways, but what I want to focus on here is, thinking about it in terms of the sharing, discussing, reflection on knowledge and actions. And that's important for teams for two reasons. Number one, it allows us to adapt, right? And number two, it allows us to create new knowledge. So one thing I want to highlight, there's several things leaders can do, but one thing that has a big impact and doesn't take a whole lot of time are team debriefs. And this is just a structured intervention that allows teams to learn from their experiences. It's typically been used within the military and is known as an after-action review. And in that case, it tends to be done at the very end of performance. But more recently, people have been talking about you don't need to wait till the end. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But kind of what is it? So it's a structured, like I said, it's a structured intervention. It can be led by the leader, where, the first thing that happens is we begin to set the stage. This is what we're going to do. This is why we're here. What's our focus? We may decide that we only want to focus on a small subset of knowledges or skills. You begin to ask the team for their observations. When we last performed, hey, we want to focus on better coordination. So what did we do really well? What could we have done differently with regards to coordination? What could help us be more effective? Are we missing anything? Are there any other resources we need? The key here is that this is really something that's owned by the team. So the leaders should not get up and kind of take over the discussion. It's really interactive with the team, and the leader is acting much more of a facilitator in this case. At the end, the leader would come back in, and if there were any observations or something, that they saw that the team didn't see, they might begin to bring those up. And then at the end of the day, you want to come together with an action plan. So exactly what are we going to do to move forward? What makes this effective? And it has been shown to increase performance by up to 25%, but it's active self-learning. It's got a developmental intent. So you make sure that the team members know that it's developmental. It's not punitive in any way. When you're reviewing, you tie it back to specific events. And again, it's got to include, it's really interactive in the sense that you want input from multiple team members. And so this shouldn't surprise you. Psychological safety is of paramount here. It's very hard to do an effective team brief if there is not psychological safety within the team. So what can leaders do with relation to this? Short periodic debriefs, not just at the end. Number 2, schedule a time. So we all have good intentions, but our work schedules are busy. So if a time isn't scheduled to debrief, then oftentimes it can fall by the wayside. Avoid the leader talking too much or talking at the team. Make sure that you don't only focus on task work. Again, that feeling of psychological safety, team members need to feel like they can and should weigh in. And while you look back, you also need to look forward. Some other tips. So make sure you let your team members talk first. Again, model the behavior that you want. Don't chastise somebody. And then, periodically ask, should we make an adjustment in how we do? If you see that the team is only talking about things that they've done well in areas of common agreement. The literature also shows that when debriefs are facilitated and structured debrief tend to be much more effective than non-structured debriefs. And again, make sure that the team is discussing both the positive and the negative. You don't want to just focus on the negative, but you also don't want to focus just on the positive. And like I said earlier, it depends on the climate of psychological safety. So kind of take home messages, effective team leaders are foundational for team success. Team leadership consists of facilitating the conditions for team effectiveness. So we've talked about, leaders providing compelling direction and what that looks like, the enabling structure, the norms, the composition, the meaningful work, helping to ensure that there's a supportive organizational context and that expert coaching. We talked about some of the actual behaviors that leaders do to engage in and facilitate these different conditions. And then lastly, in terms of motivation and making sure that our teams are adaptive, the role that leaders play in promoting shared leadership, psychological safety, and team learning. I think, yeah. So I guess if anybody has any questions or anything.
Do you have any suggestions for when problematic behaviors arise on a team, how to kind of correct for that? When you start seeing negativity or failures of collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the team will self-correct itself in terms of the negativity, right? So if the norms have been set up to begin with, the team members themselves will self-police and kind of put that pressure on the person. If not, then, I would suggest, pulling the person aside, and engaging in some coaching sessions. Sometimes that might be just the leader talking to them, or it might be the leader asking for, if the leader's actually seen it, you could also, ask for feedback, 360 feedback from time to time on your team, and then do a coaching session with the team at large and say, here are some of our strengths, here are some of our weaknesses, and not necessarily call a specific person out, and see if that helps. Are some of the ways. So there's a question in the chat. How do you engage active collaboration from folks who are not talkers, but might have brilliant ideas that are seen in their work? You might be speaking about me. I don't know about the brilliant ideas, but I don't generally tend to be an active talker. I tend to be an introvert. So, I think part of it is the norm for collaboration. And I think the more psychologically safe the team is, the more meaningful people think the work is. Sometimes that helps introverts. That's the way I read that anyway, that aren't talkers. Other times, it's painful, but other times it's, I've been specifically called on, hey, what do you think? And sometimes it's, hey, what do you think? And if the leader knows you really well, hey, I know you have this level of expertise. You have this different perspective. This is why you're on, this team, for example. Can you provide me with your perspective? And sometimes that'll help too, highlighting why they're there. If it's a, if it's a project group or something like that, can also help